Hey everyone, tonight we're diving into something that'll make you think twice about complaining about cafeteria food. We're talking about the weird, wild, and sometimes deadly foods that could literally get you arrested, executed, or excommunicated in medieval times. Forget what you think you know about food freedom. In the Middle Ages, your dinner could be your death sentence. So before we start this bizarre buffet of banned bites, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you're genuinely curious about history's weirdest food crimes. And let me know in the comments what's the strangest food law you've ever heard of. It's always fascinating to see what surprises you guys. Now grab a snack, assuming it's legal where you are, and let's dive into a world where your last meal might literally be your last meal. Picture this, you're starving. Your stomach is eating itself from the inside out. You haven't had a proper meal in days, and there's a beautiful piece of roasted chicken sitting right there on the table. The smell is making your mouth water. Your hands are shaking. All you have to do is reach out and take a bite. But wait, it's Friday. And that innocent piece of chicken, it could get you thrown in prison, branded a heretic, or even burned at the stake. Welcome to medieval Europe, where your appetite could be a crime. Number 1, forbidden meat on holy days. You wake up on a Friday morning in 1347. Your stomach growls like an angry beast. You stumble to your tiny kitchen, and there it is, leftover mutton from yesterday's feast. It looks perfect. It smells amazing. And eating it could ruin your entire life. The Catholic Church didn't just suggest you avoid meat on Fridays and during Lent. They demanded it. And breaking this rule wasn't just a sin, it was often a crime punishable by law. Church and state were basically the same thing back then, so religious rules became legal rules faster than you could say bacon. Eat meat on a Friday. You're looking at public humiliation, heavy fines, or even jail time. During Lent, the penalties got worse. We're talking about stocks, whipping, or being branded as a heretic. And heretics, well, they had a habit of ending up as human barbecue. The church watched everything. Your neighbors watched everything. Even your own family might turn you in if they caught you sneaking a bite of beef on the wrong day. Because reporting food criminals wasn't just encouraged, it was your Christian duty. But here's where it gets really twisted. The rich? They could buy their way out of trouble. Special pardons, indulgences, or just bribing the local priest. But if you were poor and caught with a chunk of pork on a holy day, you were screwed. No mercy, no excuses, just punishment. And the punishments weren't quick. Public humiliation in the town square, sometimes for days. Locked in stocks while people threw rotten vegetables at you. Your crime? Being hungry on the wrong day of the week. Some places took it even further. In certain towns, eating meat on forbidden days could get you excommunicated. That meant no church services, no Christian burial, and basically being treated like you were already dead. Your neighbors would cross the street to avoid you. Your family might disown you. All because you couldn't resist that leftover lamb chop. The irony, while you were starving and dreaming about meat, the priests and nobles were often eating like kings behind closed doors. Rules for thee, but not for me. Classic medieval style. So next time you grab a burger on a Friday, remember our ancestors who literally risked their lives for a taste of forbidden meat. Because in the Middle Ages, your dinner could be evidence against you. Number 2, the ban on horse meat. Now let's talk about horse meat. Yes, horse meat. And before you make that face, understand that in medieval times, people weren't being picky about protein sources. When you're one bad harvest away from starvation, anything with 4 legs starts looking like dinner. But the church had other ideas. Pope Gregory III banned horse meat in 732 AD, calling it a pagan practice. And when the church banned something, they didn't mess around. Eating horse wasn't just forbidden, it was considered devil worship. Picture this, you're a starving peasant in 1203. Your family hasn't eaten meat in weeks. Your neighbor's old horse just died, and honestly, it's looking pretty appetizing. Fresh protein free for the taking. What could go wrong? Everything. Everything could go wrong. Getting caught eating horse meat could get you accused of practicing pagan rituals. And pagan rituals? That's witchcraft territory. We're talking about trials, torture, and if you're really unlucky, being burned alive while the town watches and cheers. The church believed that eating horse meat connected you to old Germanic and Norse traditions, the kind where people worshipped multiple gods and performed blood sacrifices. To them, your dinner choice was basically announcing that you rejected Christianity and embraced Satan. But here's the cruel twist. Horses were expensive. Really expensive. Most peasants couldn't afford to own one, let alone eat one. So the people most likely to be tempted by horse meat were the ones who could least afford the consequences. And the penalties weren't just spiritual. Local lords and church officials could seize your property, exile you from town, or sentence you to years of hard labor. Your family could be shunned. Your children could be refused entry to school or church. In some regions, even being suspected of eating horse meat was enough. No proof needed. Just someone saying they saw you near a dead horse with a knife, and suddenly you're facing a tribunal of angry priests asking you to explain yourself. The paranoia got so bad that some towns appointed special investigators, basically medieval food police, to watch for signs of horse meat consumption. They'd check your cooking pots, smell your breath, and interrogate your neighbors. And if you tried to defend yourself by saying you were starving, too bad. The church's position was clear. Better to starve as a good Christian than to eat as a pagan. Death before dishonor, literally. Meanwhile, in other parts of the world, people were eating horse meat without any problems. But in Christian Europe, your taste in protein could be a death sentence. Because in the Middle Ages, even your hunger had to follow the rules. Number 3, fish fraud. You think modern food fraud is bad? Try living in medieval times when fish fraud could get you imprisoned, fined into poverty, or publicly humiliated in ways that would make reality TV look merciful. Fish was supposed to be the safe option. The church said you could eat it on Fridays and during Lent. But even fish came with its own set of crimes and punishments that could destroy your life faster than you could say catch of the day. Let's start with the obvious fraud, selling rotten fish as fresh. Fishmongers were notorious for this. They'd take fish that had been sitting in the sun for days, wash it in questionable water, maybe rub some herbs on it, and sell it to desperate customers who needed anything to eat on forbidden meat days. Getting caught selling bad fish wasn't just a business problem. It was a criminal offense. The penalties were brutal. In London, corrupt fishmongers could be sentenced to the pillory, locked in wooden stocks in the town square while angry customers pelted them with rotten vegetables, old bread, and sometimes the very fish they tried to sell. But the fraud got more creative. Some sellers would take cheap river fish and try to pass them off as expensive sea fish. Others would sell rat meat, cat meat, or even dog meat disguised as fish. Yes, you read that right. They'd shape other animals' meat to look like fish fillets, season them heavily, and hope no one noticed. The church took fish fraud personally. You see, eating fish on holy days wasn't just about following rules, it was about spiritual purity. Tricking people into eating forbidden meat on sacred days was basically condemning their souls. So fish fraudsters weren't just cheating customers, they were messing with people's eternal salvation. And then there were the customers who knowingly bought fake fish. Maybe they couldn't afford real fish, or maybe they were just desperate. Either way, if authorities found out you'd purchased and eaten fraudulent fish on a religious day, you could be charged as an accomplice. The investigations were thorough and humiliating. Church officials would examine your vomit, check your kitchen scraps, and interrogate your family. They'd dissect whatever was left of your meal to determine what animal it really came from. Medieval CSI, but with way more public executions. Some towns hired official fish inspectors, people whose entire job was to sniff, poke, and examine fish to make sure it was legitimate. They had the power to shut down markets, arrest vendors, and confiscate entire shipments. And here's where it gets really twisted. During famines, when people were literally dying of hunger, fish fraud increased. Desperate sellers and desperate buyers created a black market of questionable protein. But the punishments didn't get lighter because of the circumstances. If anything, they got harsher. The authorities figured that crime during hard times needed to be stopped with fear. So fish fraudsters during famines could face exile, branding, or even execution. Because apparently, dying with dignity was better than living on lies. So the next time you buy fish from the grocery store, and it's clearly labeled with its origin, species, and sell-by date, thank modern food regulations. Because our ancestors literally risked their lives just to know what they were eating. Number 4, black market pork. Pork in medieval times wasn't just food, it was politics, power, and potential prison time all wrapped up in one delicious, dangerous package. And if you were caught on the wrong side of pork law, you could find yourself facing consequences that would make you swear off bacon forever. Here's the thing about pigs in medieval Europe: they were valuable. Really valuable. A pig could feed a family for weeks, provide leather, and even serve as currency in some regions. So naturally, the people in power wanted to control who could raise them, kill them, and eat them. Most pigs belonged to lords, monasteries, or wealthy merchants. Peasants might be allowed to keep a pig or two, but only with permission, and often they had to give a portion of the meat to their lord as payment. It was feudalism at its finest. You do the work, they get the bacon. But what happened when you got desperate? When your family was starving and your lord's pigs were right there, fat and happy and practically begging to become dinner? Well, that's when you entered the dangerous world of pork crime. Stealing a pig wasn't petty theft. It was considered a serious felony, right up there with horse theft or assault. The punishment? In many regions, death. Yes, you could be hanged for stealing bacon. Your life was literally worth less than pork chops. But even eating pork you didn't steal could get you in trouble. Maybe you bought it from someone who looked suspicious. Maybe you found a dead pig and decided not to ask questions. Maybe someone gave you pork and you didn't ask where it came from. Too bad. Ignorance wasn't a defense. The investigations were thorough and terrifying. If authorities suspected you'd eaten illegal pork, they'd search your home, question your neighbors, and examine your cooking pots for evidence. They'd look for pork fat, bones, or even the smell of bacon lingering in your kitchen. And here's where the paranoia really kicked in. Some regions required people to register their pigs with local authorities. If your pig went missing and you couldn't prove what happened to it, you could be accused of eating it illegally. Even eating your own pig without permission could be a crime. The black market for pork was real and dangerous. Secret butchers who would slaughter pigs in hidden locations, often at night, and sell the meat to desperate families. But these underground operations were constantly under threat. Getting caught meant prison, fines, or worse. Church officials were especially strict about pork during Lent and other fasting periods. Eating pork when you were supposed to be spiritually purifying yourself wasn't just breaking civil law, it was defying God. And medieval justice didn't distinguish between the two. Some people tried to get creative. They'd cure pork with heavy spices, trying to disguise it as something else. They'd mix it with other meats, or even try to pass it off as beef. But the authorities knew all the tricks. They'd been dealing with desperate people and illegal pork for centuries. The cruelest part: the punishments often included public humiliation. You'd be paraded through town with the evidence of your crime, sometimes forced to wear pig parts around your neck while people jeered and threw things at you. And if you were really unlucky, you might face trial by combat or ordeal. Imagine having to prove your innocence by walking on hot coals or sticking your hand in boiling water, all because someone accused you of eating the wrong kind of meat. So yeah, when you're enjoying your next BLT, spare a thought for medieval folks who literally died for bacon. Because in their world, pork wasn't just breakfast, it was a roll of the dice with your life. Number 5. Forbidden exotic foods. Imagine craving something as simple as black pepper and knowing that getting caught with it could brand you as a thief, a smuggler, or worse, someone trying to live above their station. In medieval Europe, exotic foods weren't just expensive, they were practically illegal for anyone below noble rank. Spices like cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves, and saffron weren't just costly, they were symbols of power. Only the wealthy were supposed to enjoy them. If you were a peasant caught with a pinch of imported pepper, authorities assumed you'd stolen it. And theft of luxury goods? That was a serious crime. Picture this: you're a blacksmith in 1289. You've worked extra hours, saved every copper coin, and finally bought a small amount of precious pepper from a traveling merchant. You're excited to taste something other than bland porridge for once. You get home, add it to your stew, and start eating. Then your neighbor smells it. That rich, exotic aroma drifting from your window. Within hours, there's a knock at your door. Local officials want to know where a common blacksmith got his hands on noble spices. Your receipt? What receipt? Your explanation? Sounds like a lie. Suddenly you're facing charges of theft, fraud, or black market trading. The penalties could include heavy fines, imprisonment, or having your hands cut off, all because you wanted to taste pepper. The church made it worse by declaring that gluttony and excessive pleasure were sins. Eating fancy foods was seen as prideful, especially if you were supposed to be humble and poor. Monks would patrol markets looking for peasants buying luxury items. Getting caught meant spiritual counseling at best, accusations of sinful pride at worst. Some spices were so rare and valuable that possessing them without noble blood was automatically suspicious. Saffron, worth more than gold, was basically reserved for royalty. If a commoner was found with saffron, authorities assumed it was stolen from a lord's kitchen or smuggled illegally. The paranoia extended to imported fruits, rare wines, and even certain types of honey. Sugar, when it became available, was treated like contraband. White bread made from expensive wheat flour was monitored. Eating above your social class wasn't just rude, it was criminal. Merchants had to be careful too. Selling luxury foods to the wrong people could get them in trouble with both the church and local nobles. Some were required to keep records of who bought what, essentially creating a medieval surveillance system for fancy food. And here's the twisted part. Even if you could somehow afford these exotic foods legally, eating them publicly could still get you in trouble. Other peasants might report you for showing off or trying to act noble. The authorities might decide you were getting too big for your britches. The investigations were invasive and humiliating. Officials would search your home, examine your cooking pots, and even smell your breath looking for evidence of forbidden flavors. They'd question your family, your neighbors, and your co-workers about your eating habits. Some regions had food sumptuary laws, actual legislation that dictated what different social classes were allowed to eat. Violating these laws wasn't just about the food itself, it was about challenging the entire social order. And challenging the social order was treason. The cruelest irony? Many of these exotic spices had medicinal properties. People suffering from illness might risk everything to obtain ingredients that could help them heal. But even dying wasn't considered a good enough excuse to break food laws. So when you're casually adding cinnamon to your coffee or black pepper to your eggs, remember that you're enjoying freedoms that could have gotten your ancestors executed. Because in medieval times, flavor wasn't just about taste, it was about knowing your place. Number 6, bread riots. Bread in medieval times wasn't just food. It was politics, economics, and survival all baked into one loaf. And getting it wrong, whether you were making it, selling it, or buying it, could trigger riots, executions, and social upheaval that would make modern protests look like peaceful picnics. Let's start with the bakers. These weren't friendly neighborhood bread makers. They were heavily regulated, constantly watched, and one bad loaf away from prison. Every town had strict laws about bread weight, ingredients, and pricing. Bakers who cheated weren't just losing customers, they were committing crimes against the public good. The most common scam was short weighting. A baker would promise a 2-pound loaf, but deliver one that weighed 1.5 pounds. Sounds minor, right? Wrong. For families living on the edge of starvation, that missing bread could mean the difference between eating and dying. When bakers got caught cheating, the punishments were designed to be both painful and public. The pillory was popular, locked in wooden stocks in the town center, while angry customers threw things at you. But some towns got creative. Bakers might be forced to eat their own fraudulent bread, especially if it was moldy, gritty, or made with sawdust. Then there was the quality issue. During famines, desperate bakers would bulk up their flour with anything they could find. Sawdust, ground acorns, chalk, even clay. The bread looked normal, but tasted like dirt and could make people seriously sick. Selling adulterated bread wasn't just fraud, it was poisoning. But here's where things got really dangerous: bread prices. When grain was scarce, bread prices skyrocketed. And when bread became unaffordable, people rioted. Not gentle protests, violent, destructive riots that could burn down entire neighborhoods. Bread riots weren't just about hunger. They were about justice. When people saw bakers getting rich while families starved, when they suspected price manipulation or hoarding, they took matters into their own hands. Bakeries were destroyed, bakers were beaten, and sometimes killed. The authorities' response was swift and brutal. Riot leaders could be hanged. Participants could be flogged, imprisoned, or exiled. But the riots kept happening because bread wasn't optional. It was life. Some towns tried to prevent riots by controlling bread production completely. Government-appointed bread inspectors would weigh every loaf, test ingredients, and set official prices. Bakers became essentially government employees, watched constantly, and punished harshly for any violations. And then there were the customers who participated in bread crime. Buying bread you knew was fraudulent, hoarding bread during shortages, or stealing bread from bakeries could all land you in serious trouble. Even complaining too loudly about bread quality could be seen as sedition. The most terrifying part? Bread riots could escalate quickly into full-scale rebellions. What started as anger over expensive bread could turn into attacks on the wealthy, the church, and the government. Authorities knew this, so they cracked down on bread-related crimes with extreme force. During the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381, bread shortages and price manipulation were major triggers. Thousands of people marched on London, burned buildings, and killed officials. The response? Mass executions. Leaders were hanged, drawn, and quartered. Participants were hunted down and killed. So when you're complaining about the price of bread at the grocery store, remember that your ancestors literally died fighting for affordable carbs. Because in medieval times, bread wasn't just breakfast, it was the foundation of civilization, and messing with it could topple kingdoms. Number 7. Hunting and eating the king's deer. Venison in medieval times wasn't just meat, it was a symbol of royal power, and eating it without permission could get you killed in ways that would make horror movies look tame. The king's deer weren't just animals, they were living emblems of monarchy, and poaching them was basically declaring war on the crown. Here's how it worked. Vast areas of forest were declared royal hunting grounds. These weren't just small parks, we're talking about thousands of acres where deer, boar, and other game animals lived under the king's personal protection. And by protection, I mean armed guards, brutal laws, and punishments that would make you never want to see another deer again. Picture this, you're a starving peasant in 1195. You haven't eaten meat in months. Your children are crying from hunger, and your wife is getting weaker every day. Then you see it, a beautiful deer grazing peacefully in the forest. It's right there. No one's watching. Just one arrow, and your family could eat for weeks. But that deer belongs to the king. And taking it isn't just theft, it's treason. The laws around royal game were insane. Not only couldn't you hunt deer, you couldn't even own weapons capable of killing them. Bows, crossbows, hunting dogs, all forbidden to commoners. Getting caught with hunting equipment near royal forests could get you imprisoned even if you hadn't killed anything. And the surveillance was intense. Forest wardens patrolled constantly, looking for signs of poaching. Snares, blood trails, or even just footprints near deer paths could trigger investigations. They'd search your home, question your family, and examine your cooking pots for evidence of venison. The punishments were designed to be both painful and public. Poachers could be blinded, castrated, or have their hands cut off. Some were hanged. Others were exiled. And in extreme cases, they were drawn and quartered, torn apart by horses while still alive. But here's where it gets even more twisted. Even accidentally killing a deer could be a crime. If your crops were being destroyed by royal deer and you put up fences that injured or killed them, you could be charged with damaging royal property. The deer had more rights than you did. The paranoia extended to anyone who might have eaten venison. If your neighbors smelled roasted meat coming from your house and couldn't account for where you got it, they might report you for suspected poaching. The authorities would investigate, and if they found deer bones or antlers anywhere near your property, you were guilty until proven innocent. Some poachers try to be clever. They'd hunt at night, bury the evidence, or trade venison for other goods to avoid detection. But the forest wardens knew all the tricks. They'd set traps, use informants, and even torture suspects to get confessions. The social dynamics were cruel, too. Rich nobles could hunt deer freely, often for sport rather than food. They'd kill dozens of animals in a single day, while peasants starved just miles away. But touching even one royal deer could cost a commoner their life. And during times of famine, the temptation became unbearable. Families would watch deer graze peacefully while their children died of hunger. Some took the risk anyway, knowing they might be signing their own death warrants. Because when you're desperate enough, even certain death starts looking better than slow starvation. The enforcement was uneven and often corrupt. Poor poachers faced brutal punishment, but wealthy ones could sometimes buy their way out of trouble. Justice was for sale, but only if you could afford it. So the next time you see deer grazing peacefully in a park, remember that for centuries, those animals represented the difference between eating and dying, between following the law and feeding your family. Because in medieval times, the king's deer were more valuable than peasant lives. Number 8. Eels and swans for the rich only. Eels and swans in medieval times were like luxury cars today. Beautiful, expensive, and absolutely forbidden to anyone who couldn't prove they deserved them. Getting caught eating these elite delicacies without proper social credentials could land you in prison, bankruptcy, or worse. Let's start with eels. These slimy, snake-like fish were considered the height of sophistication. They were served at royal banquets, noble weddings, and important church ceremonies. But for commoners, eels were completely off-limits. Not because they were hard to catch, rivers and streams were full of them, but because eating them was essentially claiming a social status you didn't have. Eel fishing was heavily regulated. Only licensed fishermen, usually working for noble households, were allowed to catch them in certain waters. If you were caught with eel fishing equipment as a peasant, authorities assumed you were either poaching or planning to eat above your station. Either way, you were in trouble. The penalties for illegal eel consumption were harsh and public. Offenders could be fined amounts that would bankrupt their families for generations. Some were sentenced to public flogging. Others were forced to perform humiliating public penance, often involving wearing signs that announced their crime to the entire town. But swans? Swans were even more dangerous to eat. These graceful white birds were considered so noble, so pure, so symbolically important that eating one without permission was basically insulting God, the king, and the entire social order all at once. In England, all swans belonged to the crown. Every single one. They were marked with special cuts on their beaks to identify ownership, and killing or eating an unmarked swan was automatically assumed to be poaching royal property. The punishment for swan theft could be imprisonment, massive fines, or even death. Swan meat was served at the most exclusive feasts, often presented whole with their feathers restored to look like they were still alive. It was theater as much as dinner, a way for the wealthy to demonstrate their power over nature and over the people who served them. But poor people sometimes got desperate. Swans were large, meaty, and lived in easily accessible ponds and rivers. During famines, the temptation to kill and eat a swan became overwhelming. Some families risked everything for one meal that might keep them alive another week. The investigations were brutal. If a swan went missing, local officials would search every nearby home. They'd look for feathers, bones, or any evidence of cooking. They'd interrogate neighbors and offer rewards for information. The entire community would be under suspicion until the crime was solved. And here's the most twisted part. Even accidentally killing a swan could be a crime. If you were fishing and accidentally caught a swan in your net, if your dog chased and injured one, if you threw a rock and hit one by mistake, you could still face charges. Some regions had special swan wardens whose only job was protecting these birds and prosecuting anyone who harmed them. They had the authority to arrest, fine, and prosecute. They were basically medieval swan police. The class warfare aspect was obvious and intentional. While nobles feasted on eel and swan, peasants were forbidden from even dreaming about such luxury. It wasn't about protecting rare species. It was about maintaining social hierarchy through food. And the enforcement was often corrupt. Rich poachers could buy pardons or pay bribes. Poor ones faced the full force of the law. Justice was served on a silver platter, but only if you could afford the silver. Even being accused of eating illegal eel or swan could ruin your reputation permanently. Your neighbors would suspect you of being a criminal or a social climber. Your family might be shunned. Your business could be destroyed. So the next time you see swans swimming gracefully in a pond or eels slithering through an aquarium, remember that these creatures once represented the ultimate forbidden fruit. Because in medieval times, your dietary choices weren't just about taste. They were about knowing your place and staying there. Number 9. Accused of cannibalism. We need to talk about the darkest chapter in medieval food law, cannibalism. And before you click away, understand that this wasn't just about deranged individuals. This was about what happened when desperation met starvation, when survival trumped morality, and when accusations alone could get you burned alive. Famines in medieval Europe weren't just food shortages. They were apocalyptic events that could last for years. Crops failed, livestock died, and entire regions descended into starvation, so severe that people began to eye each other as potential meals. And when that happened, civilization collapsed into something unrecognizable. During the Great Famine of 1315 to 1322, chroniclers recorded stories that still haunt historians today. Parents eating children. Children eating parents. Neighbors disappearing in the night. Bodies found with chunks of flesh carved away. It wasn't madness, it was mathematics. One person's death could keep another person alive for weeks. But here's where the legal nightmare began. Proving cannibalism. How do you investigate a crime where the evidence has been literally consumed? How do you distinguish between murder and mercy killing? Between desperation and evil? The authorities' solution was typically medieval. When in doubt, assume guilt. Anyone accused of cannibalism faced immediate arrest, brutal interrogation, and trials that were more like public executions. The mere suspicion was enough to destroy your life. The investigations were horrifying. Suspected cannibals were tortured to extract confessions. Their homes were searched for human bones, cooking implements stained with blood, or personal belongings of missing people. Their neighbors were interrogated. Their family members were questioned under threat of being charged as accomplices. And the accusations flew freely during famines. Someone goes missing. Must be cannibalism. Someone looks too well-fed during starvation. Definitely cannibalism. Someone acts strangely or seems secretive. Obviously a flesh eater. The trials were swift and merciless. Evidence was often circumstantial, a bone that might be human, a stew that tasted suspicious, or testimony from panicked neighbors. But proof wasn't really the point. The point was to restore social order through fear and punishment. Convicted cannibals faced the worst deaths medieval justice could devise. Burning alive was common, often preceded by torture designed to extract the names of accomplices. Some were hanged, drawn, and quartered. Others were simply beaten to death by angry mobs. But here's the most terrifying aspect. False accusations were rampant. During times of mass starvation, communities turned against each other. People used cannibalism accusations to settle old scores, steal property, or eliminate rivals. Your enemy could literally accuse you of eating people, and you'd be dead within days. The church's position was absolute. Cannibalism was not just murder and a sin against God's creation. It was also a rejection of Christ's message of love and sacrifice. Cannibals were seen as having sold their souls to Satan, making them irredeemable and worthy only of death. Some communities tried to prevent cannibalism through extreme measures. They'd guard cemeteries to prevent grave robbing for meat. They'd bury bodies immediately after death, sometimes in mass graves with lime to prevent exhumation. They'd patrol at night looking for signs of suspicious activity. And here's the cruelest twist. Sometimes the accusations were political. During conflicts between regions or social classes, cannibalism charges became weapons. Enemies could be eliminated simply by planting evidence or spreading rumors. Your political views could literally be used to frame you as a man-eater. The paranoia was so intense that even discussing cannibalism could be dangerous. Talking about survival tactics, mentioning the taste of different meats, or even joking about eating people could be taken as evidence of criminal intent. Children born during famine periods were sometimes viewed with suspicion their entire lives. If their parents had survived when others died, if they seemed too healthy, if there were whispers about their family, they could carry the stain of suspected cannibalism forever. So when you're casually ordering a rare steak or making jokes about being hungry enough to eat someone, remember that cannibalism accusations were among the most terrifying charges in medieval law. Because in those times, the line between survival and sin was written in blood, and crossing it meant there was no coming back. Number 10. The Church's food laws. By now you might think we've covered all the ways food could get you arrested in medieval times. But we've saved the most comprehensive, most invasive, and most deadly food control system for last. The Church's complete domination over what, when, and how you were allowed to eat. The Catholic Church didn't just influence medieval life, it controlled it. And nowhere was this control more personal, more detailed, and more punishing than in their food laws. These weren't just suggestions or spiritual guidelines. They were legal codes enforced by both religious and civil authorities, backed by the threat of imprisonment, torture, and execution. Let's start with the calendar. The Church divided the year into feast days and fast days, and getting them wrong could brand you as a heretic. Lent lasted 40 days. Advent was 4 weeks. Fridays were always meatless. Ember days scattered throughout the year. Saints' feast days with specific dietary requirements. Over 150 days per year had special food restrictions. Keeping track of all this wasn't just difficult, it was nearly impossible for illiterate peasants. But ignorance wasn't an excuse. Not knowing the rules could still get you punished just as harshly as deliberately breaking them. The restrictions went far beyond just avoiding meat. During fasting periods, you couldn't eat eggs, dairy, or anything that came from an animal. No butter, no cheese, no milk. Some interpretations even banned fish that were too flavorful or enjoyable, because apparently God wanted you to suffer while you ate. But here's where the hypocrisy became obvious. The rules had loopholes big enough to drive a wagon through, but only if you had money. Rich people could purchase indulgences, literally buying permission to break food laws. They could hire private chaplains to interpret rules favorably. They could claim medical exemptions or travel exceptions. Poor people, no such luck. Your choice was simple: follow the rules exactly or face the consequences. And the consequences were designed to be worse than hunger. Church food inspectors were everywhere. These weren't friendly priests offering spiritual guidance. They were investigators with the power to search your home, question your family, and examine your bodily waste for evidence of forbidden foods. Yes, they would literally inspect your vomit and excrement looking for traces of illegal meat. The trials were nightmarish. Accused food criminals faced church courts where the judges, jury, and executioner were all the same people. Evidence could include testimony from neighbors, examination of cooking implements, or even just suspicious behavior during mealtimes. And the punishments escalated quickly. First offense might be public penance, standing outside the church wearing a sign announcing your sin while people spat on you. Second offense could mean imprisonment, heavy fines, or physical punishment. Third offense, you might be branded as a habitual heretic, and that was basically a death sentence. The social pressure was intense. Communities were encouraged to watch each other, report violations, and turn in their own neighbors for spiritual crimes. Your children were taught to report their parents. Your spouse might betray you to save themselves from suspicion. But here's where the church food laws became truly insidious. They created a system where everyone was guilty of something. The rules were so complex, so numerous, and so constantly changing that perfect compliance was impossible, which meant the church could selectively enforce them against anyone they wanted to control. Political dissidents could be charged with food violations. Unpopular community members could be investigated for dietary crimes. Women who spoke out could be accused of gluttony or prideful eating. The food laws became tools of social control more powerful than armies. And the punishments weren't just physical. Breaking church food laws could result in excommunication, being cut off from all religious services, community support, and Christian burial. In a world where your afterlife depended on church approval, this was worse than death. Some food laws were so bizarre they seemed designed to trap people. Eating too enthusiastically could be gluttony. Not eating enough could be vanity. Enjoying your food too much was sinful pleasure. Complaining about bad food was ingratitude. You couldn't win. The enforcement extended into your private home. Church officials could enter your house during mealtimes to observe your eating habits. They'd watch to see if you prayed before eating, if you ate appropriate portions, if you showed proper gratitude. Your dinner table became a stage for religious performance, and the definitions of forbidden foods kept expanding. Certain types of bread were deemed too luxurious for common people. Some vegetables were considered too pleasurable. Even the way you prepared legal foods could be illegal. Cooking methods that made food too enjoyable were seen as encouraging gluttony. The most terrifying aspect was the informant system. The church encouraged people to report food violations by offering spiritual rewards, forgiveness for their own sins, reduced penance, or special blessings. This turned every meal into a potential crime scene and every neighbor into a potential prosecutor. Children were especially vulnerable. They couldn't understand the complex rules but could still be punished for breaking them. Families lived in constant fear that their child might accidentally eat the wrong thing on the wrong day and bring church investigators to their door. And here's the final cruel twist. The church's food laws created artificial scarcity and inequality. By restricting what common people could eat, they drove up demand and prices for noble foods. The system was designed to keep the poor hungry and the rich well-fed. So when you're freely choosing what to eat without checking a religious calendar or worrying about spiritual consequences, remember that you're exercising freedoms that could have gotten your ancestors killed. Because in medieval times, your appetite wasn't just personal, it was political, spiritual, and potentially fatal. The church's food laws didn't just control what people ate. They controlled how people thought about food, pleasure, social class, and their own worth. And that kind of control was more powerful than any crown or sword. So there you have it, 10 ways your dinner could have gotten you arrested, executed, or eternally damned in medieval times. From forbidden Friday meat to royal deer, From black market pork to sacred swans, from exotic spices to basic bread, food in the Middle Ages wasn't just about nutrition. It was about power, control, and survival. But let's step back for a moment and really think about what we've just explored. Because this isn't just a collection of weird historical facts. This is a window into a world where your most basic human need, the need to, was weaponized against you by the very people who claimed to protect and guide you. Every single bite you took was monitored, judged, and potentially punished. Your appetite wasn't personal, it was political. Your hunger wasn't private, it was public property. Your dinner table wasn't a place of comfort, it was a courtroom where you were always the defendant. Think about the psychological torture of living this way. Imagine waking up every morning knowing that something as simple as eating the wrong food on the wrong day could destroy your entire life. Imagine the constant anxiety of checking the church calendar before every meal. Imagine the fear of your own neighbors, your own family, your own children potentially reporting you for the crime of being hungry. And here's what makes it even more disturbing. These weren't just random laws created by paranoid rulers. This was a carefully designed system of control that kept people divided, desperate, and dependent. When everyone is watching everyone else for food crimes, nobody has time to organize against the real criminals, the ones who created a system where starvation was legal, but eating was often illegal. The church and nobility didn't just control what you ate. They controlled your relationship with pleasure, with satisfaction, with the basic joy of a good meal. They turned food, something that should bring families together, into a source of division, suspicion, and fear. But let's dig deeper into what this really meant for ordinary families. Picture a mother in 1340 trying to feed her children during a particularly harsh winter. She's got a piece of meat that might be pork, might be beef, she's not really sure. Her kids are crying from hunger. She knows it's Friday, but she also knows her children might not survive another day without protein. What does she do? Follow God's law and watch her children starve? Or break God's law and risk her entire family being branded as criminals? There's no good choice. Every option leads to suffering. And that's exactly how the system was designed to work. The psychological impact of these food laws extended far beyond individual meals. They created a culture of scarcity, shame, and surveillance that poisoned social relationships. Neighbors became enemies. Families became informants. Communities became prisons where everyone watched everyone else for signs of dietary sin. Children grew up learning to associate food with fear. They were taught that their natural hunger could be evil, that enjoying their food could be sinful, that asking for more could be criminal. Imagine the long-term trauma of growing up in a world where your most basic instincts were constantly under attack. And let's talk about the women. In a society where women were already considered property, food laws gave men and authorities even more control over their bodies and choices. A woman caught eating forbidden food could be punished not just for the crime itself, but for the supposed moral weakness that led to it. She was responsible not just for her own dietary sins, but for tempting others with her lack of self-control. The class warfare aspect of these laws was both obvious and brutal. The same church officials who prosecuted peasants for eating meat on Fridays were dining on roasted fowl in their private chambers. The same nobles who executed poachers for killing deer were hosting elaborate hunts where they killed dozens of animals for sport. But the system was designed to maintain this inequality. By creating different food laws for different classes, by making certain foods literally criminal for certain people, the authorities ensured that social mobility was not just difficult, it was illegal. You couldn't eat your way up the social ladder because eating above your station was a crime. The economic impact was devastating. Families spent enormous portions of their income on legal foods that were often nutritionally inferior to the illegal alternatives. They went into debt buying fish on Fridays when eggs would have been cheaper and more nutritious. They starved during fasting periods when stored meat sat rotting in their cellars. And the corruption was rampant. Church officials who were supposed to be models of spiritual purity were often the worst offenders. They'd accept bribes to overlook food violations, sell fake indulgences to wealthy sinners, and use food law accusations to eliminate personal enemies. Local authorities learned to use food laws as revenue generators. Fines from food violations helped fund their operations. Property seized from convicted food criminals lined their pockets. The justice system became a business model built on hunger and fear. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of these food laws was how they perverted the very concept of charity and community support. Sharing food with hungry neighbors could be illegal if it was the wrong type of food or the wrong day. Helping someone during a fast could make you an accomplice to sin. The basic human impulse to feed others was criminalized. Think about the spiritual damage this caused. People were taught that God cared more about what they ate than whether they survived. That divine love was conditional on dietary compliance. That their relationship with the sacred depended on their ability to navigate an impossible maze of food regulations. The record-keeping was obsessive and invasive. Church officials maintained detailed records of who ate what, when, and with whom. They tracked patterns, investigated anomalies, and built cases against suspects over months or even years. Your eating habits became evidence that could be used against you at any time. And the violence wasn't just official. Communities turned on each other with horrifying brutality. Food riot participants were beaten to death by their own neighbors. Suspected cannibals were torn apart by mobs. Accused heretics were burned alive while their former friends watched and cheered. The psychological effects lasted generations. Even when these laws were eventually relaxed or eliminated, the trauma remained. People continued to associate food with danger, pleasure with sin, and survival with guilt. Cultural memories of food-related persecution influenced eating habits and social relationships for centuries. But here's what's truly remarkable about human resilience. People found ways to resist, even in this oppressive system. Secret recipes passed down through families. Hidden food stores. Underground networks that shared illegal meals. Code words for forbidden foods. Communities that protected each other from food police. Women especially developed sophisticated systems for evading food laws. They disguise forbidden ingredients, create false testimony to protect neighbors, and pass information about safe eating through informal networks. Their kitchens became centers of quiet resistance. Children learned to lie about what they'd eaten, when they'd eaten it, and who had fed them. They developed elaborate stories to protect their parents from food law enforcement. Childhood innocence was sacrificed to navigate adult corruption. And throughout all of this, people continued to dream about better food, better times, and better systems. They told stories about lands where food was plentiful and free. They sang songs about magical feasts that never ended. They kept hope alive through imagination when reality was too cruel to bear. The merchants who risked everything to smuggle exotic spices to common people weren't just conducting business. They were conducting revolution. Every illegal transaction was a small rebellion against a system designed to keep people hungry and powerless. The farmers who secretly shared their harvests with starving neighbors weren't just being kind, they were being radical. Every shared meal was an act of defiance against laws that criminalized compassion. The families who found ways to celebrate feast days despite poverty and persecution weren't just surviving, they were preserving humanity's connection to joy, community, and the sacred act of breaking bread together. Look at what we've learned about medieval food laws, and you'll see they weren't really about food at all. They were about control, psychological, spiritual, social, and economic control, so complete that it reached into people's kitchens, their stomachs, and their souls. The authorities understood something that modern people often forget. Controlling food means controlling everything else. When you can dictate what people eat when they eat it, and who they share it with, you control their time, their money, their relationships, and their sense of self-worth. But they also understood something else. Food is so fundamentally important to human survival and happiness that controlling it requires constant violence. The brutality of medieval food law enforcement wasn't an accident or an excess. It was necessary to maintain an unnatural system that went against basic human needs and instincts. And that's why these laws eventually crumbled. Not because rulers became more enlightened or merciful, but because people simply couldn't sustain the level of fear and repression required to maintain them. Human nature eventually won out over human law. The French Revolution didn't start with political speeches about democracy and freedom. It started with bread riots. People who had been criminalized for wanting adequate food finally said enough. They decided that death fighting for bread was better than death accepting starvation. Similar patterns played out across Europe. When food laws became too oppressive, when hunger became more frightening than punishment, people rose up. They burned the houses of corrupt officials. They raided the storehouses of greedy nobles. They chose revolution over submission. And through it all, food remained what it had always been, not just fuel for the body, but fuel for the soul. Communities that shared illegal meals together formed bonds stronger than law. Families that protected each other from food police created loyalty deeper than fear. People who risked everything for a taste of forbidden flavor proved that hope is stronger than oppression. So when you think about modern food freedom, remember that it wasn't given, it was fought for. Every right you have to choose your own meals was paid for with blood, sacrifice, and generations of resistance against systems designed to keep people hungry and powerless. The medieval food laws we've explored weren't ancient history. They were practice runs for every authoritarian system that followed. The tactics of control, the psychology of oppression, the weaponization of basic needs, these patterns repeated throughout history whenever people allowed fear to overcome their demand for freedom. And they're still relevant today. When you see governments restricting access to food, when you see systems that criminalize poverty, when you see authorities using basic needs as tools of control, you're seeing echoes of medieval food laws. The names change, the excuses evolve, but the fundamental dynamic remains the same. That's why understanding this history matters. Not just because it's interesting or shocking, but because it teaches us to recognize the warning signs. It shows us how quickly basic freedoms can disappear when people are afraid, desperate, or willing to trade liberty for the promise of security. The medieval peasant who risked execution for a piece of forbidden meat wasn't just hungry. They were asserting their fundamental human dignity. They were saying that their life, their family, their basic needs mattered more than arbitrary rules created by people who never missed a meal. And every time you choose what to eat without checking a government calendar, without asking permission from religious authorities, without fear of arrest or execution, you're honoring their sacrifice. You're living the freedom they died for. But don't take it for granted. History shows us that food freedom is fragile. It can disappear overnight when fear overtakes reason, when people surrender their judgment to authorities who claim to know better, when communities stop protecting each other and start policing each other instead. The vigilance required to maintain food freedom isn't just about watching government policies. It's about maintaining the kind of society where people's basic needs are more important than power structures, where sharing food with others is seen as virtue rather than crime, where diversity in diet reflects diversity in thought and culture. The medieval world tried to control people by controlling their plates. They failed because humans refused to be controlled. But their failure came at an enormous cost, generations of suffering, fear, and lost potential. People who could have been artists, inventors, or leaders instead spent their lives afraid of their own appetites. The lessons are clear. Any system that criminalizes basic human needs is unsustainable. Any authority that uses food as a weapon will eventually face resistance. Any society that allows some people to feast while others starve for artificial reasons will eventually collapse under its own contradictions. So the next time you're annoyed by food safety regulations, restaurant health codes, or labeling requirements, remember what the alternative looks like. Those modern protections exist because people learned from medieval mistakes. They chose transparency over secrecy, choice over control, abundance over artificial scarcity. And when you're sharing a meal with friends, family, or even strangers, remember that you're participating in one of humanity's most radical acts. Because for most of human history, sharing food freely, without fear, without permission, without checking who was watching, was revolutionary. The table you're sitting at isn't just furniture, it's a monument to human resistance. The food you're eating isn't just nutrition, it's freedom made edible. The conversation you're having over dinner isn't just social, it's the sound of people who refuse to let authorities control their most basic needs. Every culture that survived the medieval period did so by finding ways to preserve their food traditions despite oppression. They kept their recipes secret, passed their knowledge through underground networks, and maintained their connections to flavor, pleasure, and community even when doing so was dangerous. That's why modern food culture is so rich and diverse. It's built on the foundation of people who refuse to let their taste buds be controlled by tyrants. Every ethnic restaurant, every family recipe, every fusion cuisine represents victory over systems that tried to standardize, control, and criminalize human appetite. The spices in your cabinet connect you to traders who risked their lives smuggling flavor to people who weren't supposed to have it. The variety in your grocery store exists because people fought for the right to choose their own nourishment. The freedom to eat what you want, when you want it, represents one of humanity's greatest achievements. And it's an achievement that requires constant protection. Because the impulse to control others through their basic needs never fully disappears. It just changes forms, finds new excuses, and waits for moments of crisis when people might be willing to trade freedom for the promise of security. So eat with intention. Eat with gratitude. Eat with awareness that your freedom to choose is built on centuries of struggle. And most importantly, eat with others, because sharing food freely is still one of the most radical, most human, most revolutionary acts you can perform. The medieval world tried to turn food into a tool of oppression. We turn it back into what it was always meant to be, a source of nourishment, pleasure, community, and hope. That transformation didn't happen by accident. It happened because people like you decided that freedom was worth fighting for, one meal at a time. Thanks for joining me on this journey through history's weirdest food crimes. If you enjoyed learning about how our ancestors literally died for dining choices we take for granted, remember that their struggle isn't over. It continues every time we choose compassion over control, abundance over artificial scarcity, and freedom over fear. Keep questioning why systems exist. Keep defending the right to basic needs. Keep sharing meals with people who matter to you. And keep remembering that in the grand story of human civilization, the freedom to eat what you want, when you want it, with whom you want to share it, isn't just a convenience. It's a victory. And it's one worth protecting. Because in the end, the most important lesson from medieval food laws isn't about what people couldn't eat. It's about what they could endure, what they could resist, what they could preserve despite overwhelming oppression, and what they could pass down to us, the understanding that basic human dignity includes the right to nourish yourself without fear. That's a legacy worth savoring. And it's a freedom worth defending, one meal at a time, one choice at a time, one shared plate at a time. Until next time, eat well, eat freely, and remember, you're not just feeding your body. You're honoring everyone who fought for your right to do so. The medieval world tried to control people by controlling their plates. They failed because humans refused to be controlled. But their failure came at an enormous cost, generations of suffering, fear, and lost potential. People who could have been artists, inventors, or leaders instead spent their lives afraid of their own appetites. The lessons are clear. Any system that criminalizes basic human needs is unsustainable. Any authority that uses food as a weapon will eventually face resistance. Any society that allows some people to feast while others starve for artificial reasons will eventually collapse under its own contradictions. So the next time you're annoyed by food safety regulations, restaurant health codes, or labeling requirements, remember what the alternative looks like. Those modern protections exist because people learned from medieval mistakes. They chose transparency over secrecy, choice over control, abundance over artificial scarcity. And when you're sharing a meal with friends, family, or even strangers, remember that you're participating in one of humanity's most radical acts. Because for most of human history, sharing food freely, without fear, without permission, without checking who was watching, was revolutionary. The table you're sitting at isn't just furniture, it's a monument to human resistance. The food you're eating isn't just nutrition, it's freedom made edible. The conversation you're having over dinner isn't just social, it's the sound of people who refuse to let authorities control their most basic needs. Every culture that survived the medieval period did so by finding ways to preserve their food traditions despite oppression. They kept their recipes secret, passed their knowledge through underground networks, and maintained their connections to flavor, pleasure, and community even when doing so was dangerous. That's why modern food culture is so rich and diverse. It's built on the foundation of people who refuse to let their taste buds be controlled by tyrants. Every ethnic restaurant, every family recipe, every fusion cuisine represents victory over systems that tried to standardize, control, and criminalize human appetite. The spices in your cabinet connect you to traders who risked their lives smuggling flavor to people who weren't supposed to have it. The variety in your grocery store exists because people fought for the right to choose their own nourishment. The freedom to eat what you want, when you want it, represents one of humanity's greatest achievements. And it's an achievement that requires constant protection. Because the impulse to control others through their basic needs never fully disappears. It just changes forms, finds new excuses, and waits for moments of crisis when people might be willing to trade freedom for the promise of security. So eat with intention. Eat with gratitude. Eat with awareness that your freedom to choose is built on centuries of struggle. And most importantly, eat with others, because sharing food freely is still one of the most radical, most human, most revolutionary acts you can perform. The medieval world tried to turn food into a tool of oppression. We turn it back into what it was always meant to be, a source of nourishment, pleasure, community, and hope. That transformation didn't happen by accident. It happened because people like you decided that freedom was worth fighting for, one meal at a time. Thanks for joining me on this journey through history's weirdest food crimes. If you enjoyed learning about how our ancestors literally died for dining choices we take for granted, remember that their struggle isn't over. It continues every time we choose compassion over control, abundance over artificial scarcity, and freedom over fear. Keep questioning why systems exist. Keep defending the right to basic needs. Keep sharing meals with people who matter to you. And keep remembering that in the grand story of human civilization, the freedom to eat what you want, when you want it, with whom you want to share it, isn't just a convenience. It's a victory. And it's one worth protecting. Because in the end, the most important lesson from medieval food laws isn't about what people couldn't eat. It's about what they could endure, what they could resist, what they could preserve despite overwhelming oppression, and what they could pass down to us, the understanding that basic human dignity includes the right to nourish yourself without fear. That's a legacy worth savoring. And it's a freedom worth defending, one meal at a time, one choice at a time, one shared plate at a time. Until next time, eat well, eat freely, and remember, you're not just feeding your body. You're honoring everyone who fought for your right to do so. The medieval world tried to control people by controlling their plates. They failed because humans refused to be controlled. But their failure came at an enormous cost, generations of suffering, fear, and lost potential. People who could have been artists, inventors, or leaders instead spent their lives afraid of their own appetites. The lessons are clear. Any system that criminalizes basic human needs is unsustainable. Any authority that uses food as a weapon will eventually face resistance. Any society that allows some people to feast while others starve for artificial reasons will eventually collapse under its own contradictions. So the next time you're annoyed by food safety regulations, restaurant health codes, or labeling requirements, remember what the alternative looks like. Those modern protections exist because people learned from medieval mistakes. They chose transparency over secrecy, choice over control, abundance over artificial scarcity. And when you're sharing a meal with friends, family, or even strangers, remember that you're participating in one of humanity's most radical acts. Because for most of human history, sharing food freely, without fear, without permission, without checking who was watching, was revolutionary. The table you're sitting at isn't just furniture, it's a monument to human resistance. The food you're eating isn't just nutrition, it's freedom made edible. The conversation you're having over dinner isn't just social, it's the sound of people who refuse to let authorities control their most basic needs. Every culture that survived the medieval period did so by finding ways to preserve their food traditions despite oppression. They kept their recipes secret, passed their knowledge through underground networks, and maintained their connections to flavor, pleasure, and community even when doing so was dangerous. That's why modern food culture is so rich and diverse. It's built on the foundation of people who refuse to let their taste buds be controlled by tyrants. Every ethnic restaurant, every family recipe, every fusion cuisine represents victory over systems that tried to standardize, control, and criminalize human appetite. The spices in your cabinet connect you to traders who risked their lives smuggling flavor to people who weren't supposed to have it. The variety in your grocery store exists because people fought for the right to choose their own nourishment. The freedom to eat what you want, when you want it, represents one of humanity's greatest achievements. And it's an achievement that requires constant protection. Because the impulse to control others through their basic needs never fully disappears. It just changes forms, finds new excuses, and waits for moments of crisis when people might be willing to trade freedom for the promise of security. So eat with intention. Eat with gratitude. Eat with awareness that your freedom to choose is built on centuries of struggle. And most importantly, eat with others, because sharing food freely is still one of the most radical, most human, most revolutionary acts you can perform. The medieval world tried to turn food into a tool of oppression. We turn it back into what it was always meant to be, a source of nourishment, pleasure, community, and hope. That transformation didn't happen by accident. It happened because people like you decided that freedom was worth fighting for, one meal at a time. Thanks for joining me on this journey through history's weirdest food crimes. If you enjoyed learning about how our ancestors literally died for dining choices we take for granted, remember that their struggle isn't over. It continues every time we choose compassion over control, abundance over artificial scarcity, and freedom over fear. Keep questioning why systems exist. Keep defending the right to basic needs. Keep sharing meals with people who matter to you. And keep remembering that in the grand story of human civilization, the freedom to eat what you want, when you want it, with whom you want to share it, isn't just a convenience. It's a victory. And it's one worth protecting. Because in the end, the most important lesson from medieval food laws isn't about what people couldn't eat. It's about what they could endure, what they could resist, what they could preserve despite overwhelming oppression, and what they could pass down to us, the understanding that basic human dignity includes the right to nourish yourself without fear. That's a legacy worth savoring. And it's a freedom worth defending, one meal at a time, one choice at a time, one shared plate at a time. Until next time, eat well, eat freely, and remember, you're not just feeding your body. You're honoring everyone who fought for your right to do so.